The world knows Chuck Norris as the definition of invincibility. Six-time world karate champion, action movie icon, and the man whose name became a global meme. For years, the internet has treated him like a law of physics. Unbendable, unbreakable, untouchable. People don't just joke that he's strong. They joke that reality itself makes room for him. But the memes never tell you what the real man had to survive to become that symbol. Because while the world laughed, he doesn't do push-ups, he pushes the earth down. There were battles no black belt could win, losses that don't heal with trophies, and a kind of fear that doesn't disappear just because you learn how to hit harder. If anything, the fear gets quieter and more permanent. To understand what happened to him later, why the legend began to feel like a prisoner inside his own body, you have to go back before the championships, before Hollywood, before anyone said his name with reverence. You have to go back to a home where survival was the only victory that mattered. He was born Carlos Ray Norris in 1940 in Oklahoma, into a life already collapsing under poverty and violence. His father wasn't the warm, steady kind you see in old family photos. He was volatile, a mechanic, a veteran, and a raging alcoholic whose moods were as unpredictable as weather, and just as destructive. In that kind of house, the air is never calm. You don't relax. You listen. You learn what footsteps mean. You learn which door slam signals danger. You learn that silence is not peace. It's the pause before impact. And a child learns something else too. Invisibility can feel like a strategy. If you're small enough, quiet enough, agreeable enough, maybe the storm passes you by. But storms don't negotiate. As a boy, Chuck didn't grow up thinking about greatness. He grew up thinking about avoiding the next explosion. He watched his mother stretch exhaustion into something that resembled stability, double shifts, tight budgets, and the kind of smile a woman wears when she's trying not to scare her children. She tried to protect them, but protection has limits when the person you're protecting them from lives under the same roof. So the boys adapted. They became experts in shrinking. They learned how to disappear inside their own home. School wasn't an escape. It was just a different kind of loneliness. He was shy, anxious, and stammering. An easy target not because bullies circled him, but because people simply looked through him. There's a specific pain in being overlooked. When you're bullied, at least you're seen. When you're invisible, the message is sharper. You don't even register as worth anyone's effort. The family moved often, Oklahoma to Missouri to Kansas to California, chasing whatever fragile promise of work or starting over existed in the next town. Each move meant new hallways, new faces, and the same old reality. Poverty doesn't just take money, it takes roots. It takes continuity. It takes the feeling that tomorrow will resemble today in any way you can trust. By his early teens, he had internalized a verdict he never asked for. I am not enough, not strong enough, not important enough, not valuable enough to be protected, not valuable enough to be loved safely. And that is the seed that grows into obsession later. The need to prove, the need to become undeniable. At 18, he made a decision that wasn't about glory. It was about escape. He joined the United States Air Force. People like to romanticize that moment, like he stepped into the uniform and instantly became the man we know. But trauma doesn't work that way. You can leave a house. You can leave a town. You can leave a past behind geographically and still carry it in your blood, in your reflexes, in the way you flinch at raised voices, in the way you assume rejection before anyone speaks. That's what happened when he was stationed in Korea at Osan Air Base in the late 1950s. The setting was different: cold air, unfamiliar streets, the hum of military routine. But inside, he was still the same quiet young man who didn't know what he was worth. He wore authority as part of the job, but it didn't reach the deeper place where identity lives. Other servicemen found belonging quickly: friendships, drinking games, laughter. Chuck stayed on the margins, not because he didn't want connection, but because he didn't know how to step into it without feeling like a fraud. The old voice followed him. You don't belong. You never belonged. Then, one day, he saw something through a window that didn't look like rage-based strength. It looked like discipline. It looked like control. A small martial arts school. Men moving with precision. Calm faces. Power without chaos. And for the first time, he saw strength that didn't feel like fear. He stood there longer than he wanted to admit, watching like a starving man watching someone eat. It wasn't just curiosity. It was longing. Because when you grow up in violence, your body learns one lesson. Power belongs to the person who hurts you. You don't imagine power can be yours unless it comes with cruelty. The door opened. Or maybe he forced himself through it. Inside, he didn't walk into a miracle. He walked into humiliation. He was stiff, clumsy, out of balance. His body didn't know the language yet. And around him were students who moved like they were born knowing how to do it. He sweated, stumbled, and failed in ways that would have crushed him back home. But here, failure wasn't punishment. It was instruction. Again, better again. That difference, small on paper, massive in the soul, was everything. Because if your entire childhood teaches you that mistakes invite pain, you stop trying. You stop risking. You stop learning. In that dojang, he found a different rule. Persistence mattered more than talent. Discipline mattered more than ego. You didn't earn respect by being loud. You earned it by refusing to quit. Night after night, he went back. Hands sore, muscles burning, pride bruised. But something inside him began to shift. Not confidence exactly. Confidence comes later. What he found first was a path. A structure sturdy enough to hold the parts of him that had never felt steady. He wasn't becoming Chuck Norris yet. He was becoming someone who could look in the mirror without immediately hearing his father's verdict. And that was the first real fight he ever won. When Chuck Norris returned to the United States in the early 1960s, he didn't come back as a hero. There were no parades, no recognition, no market waiting for what he had become overseas. He carried a black belt, a disciplined mind, and a quiet sense that something inside him had changed, but the world around him hadn't. America didn't know what Tang Soo Do was. Martial arts studios were rare, often viewed as novelties or scams. And Chuck, now married and trying to build a life, found himself back in fluorescent-lit rooms, working unfulfilling jobs that paid just enough to keep the lights on. The uniform was gone. The dojang was thousands of miles away. And the old voice, the one he thought he'd left behind, began to creep back in. Maybe this was all a detour. Maybe you're still nobody. But here was the difference this time. He didn't stop training. Late at night, after long days of clerical work, he practiced alone. Hallways became training lanes. Makeshift bags replaced proper equipment. There were no crowds, no applause, just repetition. Quiet. Discipline. The same refusal to quit that had kept him going in Korea. He wasn't chasing fame. He was fighting regression. Fighting the fear that if he stopped moving forward, he'd disappear again. Eventually, desperation forced him to gamble on himself. He opened a tiny karate school in California. It wasn't impressive. Cracked mirrors, cheap flooring, a space that looked more like a storage unit than the birthplace of a legacy. For weeks, no one showed up. He sat alone in that empty room, listening to the echo of his own doubts bounce off the walls. This was the moment most people quit, and he almost did. But persistence, the same lesson drilled into him years earlier, won again. Slowly, students came. One, then a few more. He taught the way he had been taught. Discipline over flash, control over aggression, respect above ego. Word spread quietly. Not loudly enough to make headlines, but loudly enough to matter. Then came competition. In the mid-1960s, Chuck stepped into his first major tournaments. He wasn't the loudest fighter. He didn't posture. He didn't intimidate with bravado. He fought the way he lived, measured, controlled, relentless. And he kept winning. Again, and again, and again. Between the late 1960s and early 1970s, he became untouchable in competitive karate. Title after title. Victory after victory. 6-time world middleweight champion. Fighters who were legends in their own right stepped into the ring with him and walked out defeated. From the outside, it looked like triumph. From the inside, it felt incomplete. Because trophies don't pay bills. Respect inside niche doesn't always translate to security. He was the best in the world at something the world barely noticed. And once again, invisibility took on a new shape. This time, it wasn't because he was weak. It was because his excellence didn't fit the mainstream. Then came the encounter that changed everything. Bruce Lee had heard the whispers. Not rumors, facts. He wanted to meet the man everyone in serious martial arts circles feared and respected. Their first meeting wasn't a clash of egos. It was mutual recognition. Two men shaped by discipline, each understanding the other without needing many words. Bruce saw something Hollywood couldn't see yet. Not polish, but authenticity. When Bruce cast Chuck as the antagonist in Way of the Dragon, it wasn't charity. It was instinct. The fight scene filmed in Rome didn't just showcase skill, it told a story. Chuck's presence made Bruce's victory meaningful. You believed he was unbeatable. That belief came from decades of real pain, real training, and real restraint. Overnight, everything changed. Hollywood noticed. Offers followed. But before Chuck could fully step into this new world, tragedy struck. Bruce Lee died suddenly. The man who had opened the door was gone. The loss was personal, disorienting, and heavy with survivor's guilt. Chuck didn't just lose a collaborator. He lost the one person who had truly seen him before the fame arrived. And yet, he kept going. Low-budget films, modest roles, slow progress. Critics scoffed. Audiences, however, responded. Because what Chuck brought to the screen wasn't just action, it was credibility. He didn't act tough. He was tough, shaped by a lifetime of being forced to endure. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the invisible boy from Oklahoma had finally become visible to the world. But the cost of visibility was something he wouldn't fully understand until much later. Because the higher you climb, the more distance grows between who you are and what people think you represent. And soon, Chuck Norris wouldn't just be a man anymore. He would become a symbol. And symbols don't get to be fragile. By the time the 1980s arrived, Chuck Norris had finally crossed the invisible line between working actor and cultural fixture. Films like The Octagon and Missing in Action didn't just succeed. They defined a specific kind of American hero. Quiet, moral, unyielding. A man who didn't talk much because he didn't need to. His body did the convincing. But nothing cemented that image more permanently than television. In 1993, Walker, Texas Ranger premiered with modest expectations. Network executives saw it as filler, an old-fashioned action show built around a stoic lead, clear good versus evil storytelling, and uncomplicated justice. Critics dismissed it almost immediately. Too simple, too stiff, too dated. Audiences disagreed. Week after week, millions tuned in. Families watched together. Parents trusted it. Kids idolized it. Chuck's character, Cordell Walker, wasn't just a lawman. He was certainty in human form. In a world that was starting to feel morally blurry, Walker never hesitated. He didn't doubt. He didn't compromise. He punished wrong and rewarded right with clockwork consistency. And that consistency made Chuck Norris something more powerful than a star. It made him a symbol. The show ran for 8 seasons. Over 200 episodes. Syndicated globally. At its peak, it pulled in over 15 million viewers a week and aired in more than 100 countries. Chuck's face became instantly recognizable from Texas to Eastern Europe, from South America to Asia. The boy who had once been invisible could no longer go anywhere unnoticed. Financially, it changed everything. Syndication deals, back-end points, licensing. His net worth soared. Ranch's properties, security. The kind of stability he'd never known as a child finally arrived. But stability has a shadow. The production schedule was brutal. Long days, long weeks, long stretches away from home. And while Chuck was building an empire, something quieter was eroding behind scenes. His first marriage, already strained by decades of absence and ambition, collapsed. The separation didn't just end a relationship. It created emotional distance that time would only widen. This is the part of the story that doesn't fit the myth. Because while the world saw an unshakable father figure on screen, the real man struggled with presence. He had provided. He had protected. He had built something tangible. But he had also missed moments that never repeat. Childhoods don't wait for success to catch up. And when fame peaks, it doesn't slow down to let you fix what cracked along the way. Then came the internet era. In the mid-2000s, something unexpected happened. Chuck Norris facts exploded online. Hyperbolic, absurd jokes portraying him as omnipotent. The memes went viral before viral was a concept people fully understood. They reached generations who had never seen his films or his show. Suddenly, Chuck Norris wasn't just relevant again. He was timeless. To the public, it looked like a gift. A second wave of fame. A cultural afterlife. But inside, it was complicated. Because when the world turns you into a joke about invincibility, it becomes harder to admit vulnerability without feeling like you're betraying the image everyone loves. People laughed with him, but they didn't ask how he was doing. And then life stopped joking. In 2013, Chuck received the call that every parent fears. His daughter, Dina, was gone. Sudden, unexpected, irreversible. She was only 46. The loss shattered the illusion that discipline and strength could prepare you for everything. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't something you trained for. This was final. Grief arrived tangled with guilt. The specific, cutting guilt of realizing that while he had been building a legacy for his family, he hadn't always been with his family. Funerals have a way of collapsing time, forcing you to confront not just who you lost, but who you were to them. For a man who had spent his life refusing to quit, this was the one battle he couldn't rematch. He withdrew, stepped back, reevaluated, and for the first time publicly, the myth cracked. Not violently, but quietly. Friends noticed he spoke more softly, listened longer, answered questions about regret without deflection. Then his body followed grief's lead. Heart problems, surgeries, recovery that stripped away pride. The man once known for unstoppable physicality now had to accept limits he couldn't overpower. For someone whose identity was built on control, surrender was the hardest lesson of all. And yet, this is where the story becomes something deeper than tragedy. Because instead of clinging to the image, Chuck adjusted his definition of strength. He slowed down, became more present, redirected resources toward mentoring, youth programs, and veterans, toward preventing other kids from growing up believing they were worthless the way he once did. The legend didn't disappear. It evolved. At this stage of life, Chuck Norris isn't trying to prove anything. He knows what fame gave him and what it took. He understands now that legacy isn't measured in episodes, trophies, or memes. It's measured in presence, in honesty, in what you choose to protect when the world stops watching. The myth says Chuck Norris is invincible. The truth is more meaningful. He survived long enough to understand that being human is harder than being a legend, and far more important. By the time Chuck Norris reached his 80s, the transformation was complete, not into something weaker, but into something quieter and far more honest. The days of chasing relevance were over. He no longer needed the world to validate what he had survived. The warrior had finally stepped out of the arena. Life now moved at a different rhythm. Mornings were no longer about training to dominate, but about managing pain, protecting a heart that had been cut open and repaired more than once, and accepting the discipline of limitation. Medications replaced trophies. Gentle movement replaced explosive power. Every day became an act of negotiation with time. For a man whose entire identity was built on endurance, this was the most humbling chapter of all. And then came another loss. The death of his brother, one of the last living witnesses to the childhood they survived together, hit in a way no audience could ever understand. Because when someone who remembers the beginning disappears, you don't just lose a person. You lose proof. Proof that the pain was real. Proof that the boy you once were actually existed. Suddenly, Chuck was the only one left who remembered the nights hiding from violence. The hunger, the fear, the promises whispered in the dark that someday life would be different. With that loss, the past stopped being shared memory and became something fragile, held by one aging man alone. That's when mortality stopped being abstract. 2 heart surgeries, a pandemic-era recovery spent in isolation. The awareness that if something went wrong, there might not be time for goodbyes. These moments stripped away any remaining illusion of invincibility. Not the public illusion that had already taken on a life of its own, but the private one he'd carried for decades. He had survived championships. He had survived fame. He had survived grief. Now, he had to learn how to remain. What's striking about this stage of his life isn't despair, it's clarity. Chuck no longer talks about legacy in terms of accomplishments. He talks about presence, about being available, about saying the words he once postponed. I love you. I'm proud of you. I'm here. These aren't lines from a script. They're the language of someone who finally understands what strength is for. He spent his time now not performing, but listening, with his wife, with his sons, with young people who remind him of who he might have become if discipline hadn't intervened. The same martial arts principles that once saved him are now tools he gives away freely, not to create fighters, but to create steadiness. And this is where the story turns back on us. Because the reason this hits so hard isn't because he's famous. It's because his arc is painfully familiar. So many people build their lives around survival, around proving they're worthy, capable, unstoppable, without realizing that survival mode is meant to be temporary. At some point, you're supposed to stop fighting and start living. Chuck Norris didn't fail because he wasn't strong enough. He failed in the places so many strong people fail, by confusing protection with presence, provision with love, endurance with connection. And yet, his story isn't one of condemnation. It's one of correction. He didn't get to rewrite the early chapters. He didn't get rematches for certain losses. But he did get awareness. And awareness, late as it sometimes comes, still matters. The memes will continue. They'll outlive him. People will keep joking that he's immortal, that the laws of physics bend around him. That myth is comfortable. It's funny. It's easy. The truth is heavier and far more valuable. The real lesson of Chuck Norris isn't that he never fell. It's that he fell in ways fame couldn't cushion and still chose to grow. Strength, in the end, wasn't about what he could break. It was about what he refused to break again. His family, his integrity, the chance to be present while time still allows it. So if this story leaves you unsettled, that's not an accident. It's a mirror. Ask yourself what you're building and who you might be losing while you build it. Ask yourself if you're waiting for someday to show up as the person you mean to be. Ask yourself whether the thing you're fighting so hard to protect is worth the relationships quietly eroding in the background. Because time doesn't care how disciplined you are. It only cares whether you noticed what mattered before it was gone. Chuck Norris isn't invincible. He's something far rarer. He's a man who survived long enough to understand that legacy isn't what the world says about you after you're gone. At 85, Chuck Norris no longer wakes up trying to conquer the day. He wakes up trying to understand it. That may sound small, but for a man who spent most of his life in motion, training, filming, traveling, proving, it is the most radical change of all. The mornings are slower now, deliberate. There is no rush to become something more, because there is no illusion left that more is coming. The body decides the pace. The heart sets the limits. And instead of fighting those limits, Chuck has learned to respect them. The way a seasoned warrior respects an opponent he can no longer overpower. This is the stage no one prepares you for. Because society celebrates beginnings and peaks. We love the rise. We love the domination arc. We love the highlight reel. But we rarely talk about the final stretch, the quiet stretch, where you live with the consequences of every choice you made while climbing. For Chuck, that reckoning is not loud or dramatic. It shows up in pauses, in moments where memory arrives uninvited, in the realization that the phone rings less often, not because people don't care, but because the world assumes legends don't need checking on. That's the hidden cost of becoming a symbol. You stop being asked how you're doing. And yet, there is something unexpectedly peaceful here. Because stripped of expectation, stripped of performance, stripped of the need to be impressive, Chuck Norris exists now as something far more grounded than the myth ever was. a man who knows exactly what matters and exactly what doesn't. He doesn't measure days by productivity anymore. He measures them by connection. A conversation that feels real. A laugh that isn't for an audience. A quiet evening where nothing hurts too badly and no one needs anything from him except presence. And presence, finally, is something he can give. He understands now that strength without tenderness is incomplete. That discipline without love becomes isolation. That winning every external fight means very little if you lose the internal ones quietly, year after year. This awareness didn't come cheap. It came through grief that never fully heals, through a body that no longer obeys, through the sobering understanding that time does not negotiate, no matter how legendary your past may be. But there is dignity in this chapter. Not the loud dignity of triumph, but the calm dignity of acceptance. Chuck Norris doesn't correct the memes. He doesn't argue with the myth. He lets it exist because he knows something the internet doesn't. Myths are for spectators. Meaning is for the people who live the life. And in that sense, his story stops being about fame, martial arts, or even celebrity at all. It becomes a cautionary tale and a gift. A reminder that becoming strong is only half the journey. The other half is learning when to stop proving it, learning when to put the armor down, learning when to trade invincibility for intimacy. If there is one final truth hidden beneath all the jokes, all the facts, all the legend building, it is this. The strongest people are often the ones who had to become strong too early. And the bravest thing they could do later is allow themselves to finally be human. That is what happened to Chuck Norris. Not in one dramatic moment, not on a movie set, not in a ring, but slowly, quietly, honestly. There's a moment that comes late in life, often unannounced, when the noise finally dies down. Not all at once, but gradually. Invitations slow. Phones ring less. The world moves on to newer heroes, louder stories, faster distractions. And if you've spent decades being watched, applauded, mythologized, that silence can feel unsettling at first. For some, it feels like abandonment. For others, it becomes clarity. This is where Chuck Norris lives now. Not in decline, but in a narrower, sharper awareness of what time actually is. Not a resource to be conquered. Not an enemy to be outrun. But a current you either fight until exhaustion or learn to float with. He understands something now that would have been impossible for the younger version of himself to accept. Life doesn't reward constant intensity. It tolerates it for a while. Then it asks for something else. Patience, humility, presence. In the early years, survival demanded hardness. In the middle years, success demanded endurance. But in the final stretch, meaning demands softness, the kind that doesn't weaken you, but finally lets you rest. This is the part no one claps for. There's no soundtrack for waking up sore and choosing gratitude anyway. No montage for sitting quietly with someone you love, listening instead of leading. No awards for knowing when to stop talking and simply be there. Yet these are the moments that outlast everything else. Chuck no longer frames his life as a series of wins and losses. He sees it as phases of becoming. The scared boy, the disciplined fighter, the celebrated icon, the grieving father, the aging man learning to release control one habit at a time. Each phase made sense at the time. Each one required what the next could not. And that's the real mistake people make when they idolize strength. They forget that strength must evolve, or it becomes brittle. Looking back, he doesn't deny the ambition. He doesn't regret the work. He doesn't disown the myth. He simply refuses to confuse it with truth anymore. Because truth is quieter. Truth is understanding that some battles exist only to teach you when to stop fighting. That not every problem is meant to be solved. Some are meant to be carried with grace. That the body breaking down is not a betrayal, but a message. Slow down or miss what's left. If there's wisdom earned at this stage, it's not motivational. It's sobering. You don't get unlimited chances to show up. You don't get refunds on missed time. And you don't get to decide which memories the people you love will carry of you. They won't remember how busy you were. They won't remember how impressive you looked to strangers. They will remember whether you were reachable. That is the standard Chuck now holds himself to. Reachable, present, human. So if this continuation feels quieter than the beginning, that's intentional. Because endings aren't supposed to roar. They're supposed to land. The legend already exists. It doesn't need more fuel. What matters now is the man who understands, perhaps later than he wanted, but earlier than some, that the final victory isn't staying on top. It's stepping down with awareness before life forces you to. And in that awareness, there is peace. Not the kind sold in slogans. Not the kind promised by success. The kind that comes from finally knowing what mattered and choosing it while there is still time. There is something unsettling about the way a legend fades, not in spectacle, but in quiet relevance. No announcement, no final bow, just fewer appearances, longer pauses, a gradual shift from being spoken about to being remembered. This is the space where Chuck Norris now exists. Not forgotten, not erased, but no longer needed in the way he once was. And that realization, more than age or illness, is what truly tests a man who spent his life being useful through strength. For most of his years, Chuck's value was obvious. He could fight. He could train. He could perform. He could represent certainty in an uncertain world. When danger appeared, he was the answer. When chaos threatened, he was the image of control. But what happens when the world no longer needs that version of you? That question sits quietly at the center of his final chapter. Because when usefulness disappears, identity has to stand on something else. And if you've never practiced being still, never practiced being loved without earning it, that stillness can feel terrifying. Chuck has had to learn, late in life, that worth doesn't vanish just because function does. That you don't stop mattering when you stop producing. That presence, not performance, is the last form of relevance. This lesson didn't arrive gently. It came through loss, through physical limits, through watching the world move on while he stayed behind, managing a body that no longer cooperates with memory. The mind still knows who he was. The mirror reminds him who he is now. And between those two truths is grief. Not dramatic, not loud, but constant. The grief of letting go of former versions of yourself. Most people never talk about that grief. They talk about losing others. Rarely do they talk about losing themselves. The strong version, the capable version, the admired version. Chuck has lost all three. And yet, he hasn't disappeared, because something else has taken their place. A man who understands that being needed is temporary, but being remembered for how you made people feel is permanent. A man who understands that fear once made him strong, but love is what now keeps him alive. A man who no longer measures his days by what he accomplishes, but by whether he stayed open instead of retreating inward. This is the quiet courage no meme can capture. The courage to age honestly. The courage to accept help. The courage to stop pretending you're fine when you're not. And perhaps most importantly, the courage to leave a question behind instead of an answer. Because Chuck Norris's story doesn't end with a command or a slogan. It ends with an invitation. To ask yourself who you are when the roles fall away. To ask yourself what part of your identity will survive when your body changes, when your career ends, when applause fades. To ask yourself whether you are building something that can stay with you or something that will abandon you the moment you slow down. The world will keep the legend. That part is inevitable. But the real inheritance of this story is quieter and far more personal. It's the understanding that strength is seasonal, that survival is not the same as fulfillment, and that the final measure of a life isn't how hard you fought. It's how gently you learn to live once fighting was no longer required. That is the last lesson Chuck Norris leaves behind. Not as a myth, not as a meme, but as a man who finally understood that time wins every match. And wisdom is knowing when to stop throwing punches and start holding what's left.